One quiet morning, a stranger appeared in the village. She was a small child, no older than 10, with deep, wise eyes that seemed to see through everything. No one knew where she came from, yet she wandered through the village like she had always been there. People looked at her curiously, wondering who she was and why she seemed so different from the others. Her clothes were old, but there was a certain calmness in the way she moved, as though she understood the world in a way no one else did. As the days went by, strange things began happening. The villagers would whisper about their private troubles and secrets, but somehow, this little stranger always seemed to know about them. Old man Gregor, who had always been too proud to ask for help, suddenly found someone leaving food on his doorstep every night. Mary, the baker, noticed that the child knew exactly how to cheer her up when she felt overwhelmed by her business. It was as if the child understood their hidden pain without them speaking a word. One day, as the village gathered for the annual festival, the child appeared at the heart of the crowd. She was sitting alone on the grass, her gaze distant as she watched everyone around her. People felt uneasy but were drawn to her quiet presence. It seemed like she could hear their unspoken thoughts, the secrets they hadn't shared with anyone. There was something powerful about the way she observed the world, and the villagers couldn't help but wonder how much she really knew about them. Later that evening, Sarah, a young woman who had recently lost her parents, approached the child. "How do you know so much?" she asked. The child smiled gently and replied, "I don't know everything, but I listen. I see things that others don't. Everyone has secrets, but sometimes, the only thing they need is someone to understand." Sarah, who had been carrying the weight of her grief in silence, felt a sudden lightness in her heart. It was as though the child had read her pain and acknowledged it, offering a form of solace without words. Word spread quickly that the stranger child had a way of understanding people's deepest emotions. Some villagers were skeptical, thinking it was nothing more than a strange coincidence, but others began to seek her out. Thomas, the quiet blacksmith, had always been known for his gruff demeanor. No one ever saw the sadness hidden behind his tough exterior. But one day, he found himself sitting next to the child, unable to hold back his tears as he spoke of the dreams he had given up long ago. The child said nothing, only nodding as she listened to him, her eyes soft with understanding. It wasn't long before Thomas started showing up at the village square more often, greeting people with a smile and helping others with their own troubles. Slowly, his grief faded, and he realized that all he needed was someone who didn't judge him, someone who simply listened. The child never asked for anything in return, yet she had brought healing to his heart just by acknowledging his pain. One evening, the village's most respected elder, Mara, sat with the child by the fire. "You know more about this village than anyone else," Mara said, looking into the flames. "How do you know so much?" The child smiled again and replied, "I just pay attention. People think their secrets are hidden, but the truth is, the heart always finds a way to speak, whether it's through actions, words, or silence." Mara was silent for a moment, contemplating the child's words. She had lived a long life, carrying the burdens of leadership and wisdom, but it wasn't until she met the child that she realized how much she had been hiding from others. With the child's gentle presence, Mara began to open up about her own struggles, realizing that sharing her worries didn't make her weak, it made her human. The village slowly began to change, as people began to speak more openly about their feelings, knowing that the child was always there, quietly watching and listening. A week later, the villagers decided to throw a feast to thank the child for the quiet wisdom she had brought to their lives. They had grown fond of her, but still, no one truly knew where she came from or why she had chosen their village. The child accepted their invitation with a simple nod, but she didn't seem to care much for the food or the festivities. Instead, she spent her time walking through the crowd, pausing to speak to the lonely, the sad, and the quiet souls who had long felt unseen. As the night wore on, the villagers couldn't help but notice that the child's presence seemed to bring a sense of peace to everyone she touched. There was no need for grand gestures or speeches, all she did was listen. And in that silence, she gave the greatest gift of all, understanding. People left the feast feeling lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. The next morning, when the village awoke, the child was gone. No one saw her leave, and no one knew where she had gone. The villagers searched the streets, asking each other if they had seen her, but there was no sign of the mysterious child who had changed their lives so profoundly. Some were heartbroken, others confused, but all felt a deep sense of loss. It wasn't until a few weeks later that people began to notice the changes in their lives. Sarah was no longer burdened by grief, Thomas was no longer silent. Mara had become more open with the villagers. Slowly, the village itself began to change. People were kinder, more open with each other, and more willing to help those in need. The child had left, but her influence remained, a reminder that sometimes, the most powerful change comes from simply being seen. In the months that followed, life in the village continued to improve. It wasn't that the villagers had forgotten about the child, but they had learned from her example. Now, they would often gather in the square, sharing stories, offering help, and supporting one another in ways they had never done before. The quiet, unseen wounds of the past were slowly healing as people learned to speak up and share their burdens. One afternoon, as Sarah walked through the market, she overheard a conversation between two children. "Do you remember that strange child who used to live here?" one asked. "Yeah, she could tell what you were feeling without you saying anything," the other replied. "She was so kind. I think she taught everyone how to be better." Sarah smiled to herself, knowing that the child's true gift was not in her mysterious knowledge, but in the way she had made everyone feel heard and understood. Years passed, and the village became known for its kindness and the way people supported one another. Visitors often came to learn the secret of the village's harmony, but no one could quite explain it. They would tell tales of the stranger child who had once wandered their streets, teaching them the power of listening and understanding. The child had never stayed long, but her impact had been profound, rippling through the village for years to come. One such visitor, a weary traveler, sat with an elderly man in the village square and asked, "How did this village become so peaceful?" The man smiled and said, "It wasn't magic or some grand event. It was a child who listened when no one else would. She knew everyone's secrets, not because she had special powers, but because she understood that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is just be present for someone." The traveler nodded, realizing that the true lesson of the village was one that could be taken anywhere. On the anniversary of the child's visit, the village held a celebration in her honor. It wasn't a grand affair, but a simple gathering where people took turns sharing stories of how their lives had changed since that time. As each person spoke, the atmosphere was filled with gratitude and warmth. The child's memory lived on in the hearts of everyone who had been touched by her wisdom. Even now, when someone in the village is feeling lost or overwhelmed, they know they can find comfort simply by sitting and listening to one another. It has become a tradition, a way of living that has shaped the very identity of the village. No one knows where the child came from or why she left, but the village would always carry her message, that sometimes, the most important thing we can offer each other is our presence and our attention. One day, a young girl named Lily, who had heard stories of the mysterious child, asked her grandmother, "Do you think the stranger child will ever come back?" Her grandmother smiled softly and said, "Perhaps she's already here, in all of us." Lily looked puzzled, and her grandmother continued, "The child's gift was not in her knowledge but in her ability to listen and make others feel understood. That is something we can all do, every day." Lily thought about this for a moment and then nodded. She began practicing listening more carefully, paying attention to her friends and family with the same deep understanding that the child had shown. And in time, she too became someone others turned to for comfort, just as the stranger child had once done for her village. Years later, Lily grew up to be a kind and wise woman, known throughout the village for her gentle nature and her ability to make others feel seen. One evening, as she walked through the village square, she met an old woman who had come to visit the village. The woman asked, "What is the secret of your village? How is it so peaceful and kind?" Lily smiled and replied, "It's simple. We learn to listen to each other and to be present for one another. We learned from a stranger child who taught us that sometimes, all someone needs is to be heard." The old woman was silent for a moment, then smiled. "I think I understand," she said. "The greatest gift we can give each other is not advice or solutions, but the gift of understanding." And with that, she continued on her journey, carrying the lesson of the village with her. One quiet evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Lily sat alone by the fire, reflecting on the child's legacy. She had grown up in a village transformed by kindness and understanding, and she had played a part in that transformation. She thought of the child's wisdom, how she had known everyone's secrets, not because she had some magical power, but because she had the gift of listening. And Lily realized that this was a gift that anyone could give if they only took the time to truly listen. As she sat there, lost in thought, a young boy approached her. "Can you teach me how to be like the child?" he asked. Lily smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's not something you can learn from me," she said softly. "It's something you have to learn from your heart. Listen closely, and you'll find the answers you need." The boy thought about Lily's words and started practicing what he had learned from her. He began to listen more closely to the people around him, not just to their words, but to their feelings and needs. And slowly, he began to understand the power of simply being present for others, just as the stranger child had done so many years ago. The boy's kindness spread throughout the village, and soon, he became known as someone who could make others feel understood. Just like the child, he didn't need to have all the answers, he only needed to be there for those who needed him most. And in doing so, he helped keep the legacy of the stranger child alive, ensuring that her message would never be forgotten. As time went on, the village flourished, and its people grew even closer. They knew that the secret to their happiness wasn't in wealth or success but in the strength of their community and the depth of their connections. And whenever someone new arrived in the village, they were welcomed with open arms, for the villagers knew that the greatest gift they could give was the same gift the stranger child had given them: the gift of understanding. The village became a place where people listened to one another, where secrets were shared not in fear, but in trust. And it was said that if you ever found yourself in need, all you had to do was sit quietly with someone from the village, and you would soon feel your heart lifted. For the villagers knew that sometimes, the best way to heal was simply to be heard. As an old woman, Lily sat on the same bench where she had once spoken to the young boy, now a grown man, who had become a pillar of the community. She looked out over the village, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons she had learned from the mysterious child. The village was no longer the same as it had been when she was young. It was a place of warmth and understanding, where people looked out for each other and shared their burdens without fear. Lily smiled softly, knowing that the stranger child had left a legacy that would never fade. The child had taught them all that the most powerful gift you could offer someone was not your advice, but your presence. And with that simple gift, the village had been transformed forever. Moral of the story: the greatest gift we can give others is not advice or solutions, but the gift of understanding. By listening, being present, and truly hearing what others are saying with their hearts. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change someone's world.